Okay, and here we go. Okay, Linnea, can you see my screen? Give me a quick nod if you can.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, everybody. So, oh, you know what? Let me move this out of the way. Okay. So, like Linnea said, I studied mechanical engineering in undergrad and energy systems engineering in graduate school, both at Iowa State. But what really piqued my interest in space exploration was a political science class I took with Dirk Deem. It's called Political Science 335, and it is being taught in the spring this upcoming semester. So if you're interested, if you find this presentation interesting, I really encourage you to take that class. It's really fascinating. So over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the space race from the 1950s and the 1960s. One of the most crucial years of the space race was 1968, and some of you may have heard of the reference of this lately. Given where we're at in 2020, it's been a heck of a year with the pandemic and a lot of things going on. In 1968, it was actually it was a pretty fraught year as well. So that's why people compare 1968 to 2020. It was, let's see if I can, there we go. America was in the middle of the Vietnam War. There were a lot of protests. It was quite the time. We were in the middle of the civil rights movement. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And also in 1968, it was a US presidential election year, and this is Bobby Kennedy. He was the Democratic nominee to be United States president, and he too was assassinated that year. So, like I said, it was pretty fraught. But one thing that was kind of a glimmer of hope for Americans was the space race. America had been pretty far behind the Soviet Union for quite some time, and in 1968, it was pretty clear that America was doing pretty well, and there was that glimmer of hope. So that's just kind of a comparison that you can keep in mind as I give you the history here. Overall, I find the history of NASA really fascinating. I hope you find it interesting too. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to point out examples of leadership and teamwork. That's of course the purpose of this conference. And when I point out that there's only going to be kind of three takeaways I'm going to talk about near the end. There's no secret sauce. There's no secret. I think when I explain these concepts, it won't be of any surprise to you. But I do hope that the context of the space race kind of gives you perspective and lets you think about those ideas and how you can use them and mold them into your purposes as you move forward with your career. So without any further ado, okay, so take yourself back to October 1957. You might recognize this picture in front of you. This is a picture of Sputnik. So Sputnik was the first human-made satellite to appear and launched by the Soviet Union. When this was launched, it really caught the average American off guard. No one knew what the satellite could do. In the end, all it was doing was producing basically some beeping noises, but it was a proof of concept. And it got Americans kind of nervous. And actually, the next month, the Soviet Union upped the ante, and they launched the first biological being into space, into orbit around the Earth. This is Laika, the dog. So America thought, well, by the way, I should have mentioned, we were in the middle of the Cold War. That's a whole history of itself, but there was a lot of competition between the Soviet Union and America. So if that kind of gives context here. So the Soviet Union, in a matter of 2 months, had sent the first satellite into space and then the first living organism into space. So America did not want to fall too far behind. So in December, so the next month, America attempted to launch its first satellite on a Vanguard rocket. Everything was looking successful at launch. It made it all the way to an altitude of about 4 feet. So we're going to show you a GIF right here. So everything's looking good. starting to go up, and then it's not so good as it exploded. So this clearly wasn't it wasn't meant to do that, and this was pretty embarrassing for America, considering what the Soviet Union had just accomplished over the few months beforehand. However, America persevered, and in the next month, we were able to launch our first satellite into space. It was called the Explorer satellite. And then this is kind of what, well, it's what started NASA. America before had NACA, or NACA, which is the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. But it was rebranded as NASA, as we know it today, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So with NASA formed, we thought, well, if the Soviets had sent a satellite and then a dog, the next logical step that they're probably going to do is send a human. And so NASA thought, well, we better get on that. And so soon after that, they formed Project Mercury. So Project Mercury was the first step of the space race. And so this is where NASA had a nationwide search for astronauts. We'd never had astronauts before. And what you're looking at is the Mercury 7. So the Mercury 7 are the 7 astronauts who were, or the 7 candidates who were chosen to become astronauts. When NASA was looking for candidates, they had different criteria. They had to be under 5'11". They had to be under 200 pounds. Both of those for reasons I'll get to in a moment. But also, one of the main criteria is they had to be a test pilot. And the reason NASA wanted test pilots are some pilots had what is known as the right stuff. Some of you may recognize that phrase or that term. It was coined book. I'd encourage you to read it. It's called The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. But what is the right stuff? The right stuff is, well, let's put it this way. Test pilots are testing these incredibly fast and dangerous machines for the first time. They've never been tested before. That's why they're test pilots. And these planes had a habit of maybe exploding or crashing or something malfunctioning. And many times the test pilot would perish. They would not survive. But some test pilots, they always had a knack for figuring it out. They could land the plane or eject it just the right time, and they would survive even if the plane didn't. And these test pilots were known to have the right stuff. And so that's where the phrase comes from. So these 7 definitely had the right stuff. Actually, the book by Tom Wolfe was also a movie, I think, in the 90s, and Hulu is coming out with a series called The Right Stuff in the next few months. So check it out if you're interested. So, okay, so here we go. We have the Mercury 7 astronauts. Now, similar to Soviet Union, before we wanted to send any of these astronauts into space, we wanted to send something else. So this is where we had, oh, I forgot about this picture. This is the Mercury 7 all suited up. I always find this photo interesting. It almost looks cartoonish compared to the spacesuits that we're used to today, but these are the original spacesuits with the Mercury 7, the first American astronauts. But, okay, here we go. Ham the chimp. So instead of Laika the dog, Ham the chimp was chosen to be the first American being in space. And so the thing about space, no human had ever been into space, and NASA scientists didn't know, well, do we have cognitive ability in space? Are we going to pass out, with microgravity? And who knows? No one knew what was going to happen. So what the NASA scientists did is they found they had Ham the chimp here, and what they did, they would train Ham to press certain buttons and pull certain levers based on a light. So they had a light in the capsule that Ham was in, and when it would flash, Ham had to push a button or pull a lever. So the NASA scientists would make, this was a test to make sure, okay, if Ham can think and act in space, then that's a good sign. And indeed, in January of 1961, Ham made his first flight. He did not orbit the Earth. So instead, he went very high up into space and came back down, and he survived. He was able to perform his duties in space with minimal side effect. So that was a great start. Keep in mind, this was in January 1961. Laika, the dog, the Soviet Union dog, had gone to space 3 years prior. So NASA and America were kind of behind here. We weren't exactly beating the Soviets here, but it was a start. And then in April, later on that year, the first human made it to space. Now, it wasn't an American, rather, it was Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet cosmonaut. So, of course, this photo here, that's a dummy. That's not Yuri Gagarin himself. But I wanted to show because it's quite a different spacecraft than what the Americans used. Americans used capsules, which are kind of shaped like big cones. I think many of you probably recognize what the capsules look like, and you'll see pictures of them later on. But the Soviet approach was it was different. It was a sphere. It kind of looks like a giant cannonball that Yuri Gagarin climbed in, and it was on the top of a rocket, and they shot him into space, and it worked. Yuri Gagarin went into space, and he made one orbit around Earth, and then he started the descent just as planned. And the way Yuri Gagarin landed, like I said, it went as planned, but it's kind of funny considering how we're used to Americans landing, splashdown in their capsule in the ocean. Rather, Yuri Gagarin, and here I have a laser pointer, I think. Yeah. So Yuri Gagarin, he takes off into space and he orbits the Earth, but when he's coming back down at 4.5 miles up, Yuri is shot out of his sphere, and he has his own parachute that takes him down to Earth. And then the sphere, the spacecraft, has its own parachute that takes it down to Earth. And it landed, and all went as planned. So it was good. Now, America thought, well, NASA had been hard at work, and so it was actually the next month we had Alan Shepard. So Alan Shepard became the first American into space, who went to space. So when he was sitting in his capsule, you can see on the right here, it was kind of a joke amongst the Mercury astronauts that you didn't climb into the capsule, rather you wore the capsule. So this is one reason why NASA had such, they had size limitation to be 5 foot and under 200 pounds. So Alan Shepard, he climbs into his capsule, and he successfully gets launched. He doesn't orbit the Earth. He just goes up and down, which is still quite a feat. It's the first time an American had been in space, so it was a big deal. So it was only 3 weeks later. So keep in mind, we had some troubles getting a first satellite into space. Then we had Ham the chimp. Then we had Alan Shepard. 3 weeks later, we're going to hear from this guy, President John F. Kennedy. So JFK, 3 weeks after Alan Shepard made it into space, he went to Congress, and the reason he went to Congress is he was looking to get funding for NASA. He had an idea, and so this is one of what I kind of say are two quintessential JFK NASA or moonshot speeches. So when he went to Congress, I think a lot of you will recognize this line. This is what he said: "I think this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." You should listen to the whole speech. It's very inspiring. But wow, we had just sent our first man into space 3 weeks before, and here's JFK calling a shot. And it was actually about a year later when President John F. Kennedy was visiting Rice University in Houston, Texas, and that's actually he's at the Rice University Stadium in this photo, and this is where he gave the second of his two moonshot speeches. So this is one of the main lines of his speech here. "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, one we intend to win. So the last part of that was definitely kind of a nudge at the Soviet Union. So this is where JFK really was pushing the space race. It was America versus the Soviet Union, and JFK had set the goalpost. It was the moon. We had to land on the moon and come back. So these speeches by John F. Kennedy, it's not even the speeches. It's definitely the vision that he had. It really exemplifies him as a leader. So JFK had a lot going on. He had a lot to focus on. He was president of the United States. We weren't really that far gone from World War II. Vietnam is coming up. He had the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a lot going on. And yet he thought, this is a mission that is worthwhile. This is something I think we can achieve. Is it hard? Absolutely. But we're going to commit ourselves to it. And I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but that, of course, is an excellent trait of great leadership there, just having that vision and communicating and getting others involved. So it was about not long after JFK gave this speech, we had John Glenn. John Glenn went into space. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. So while Alan Shepard and another astronaut, Gus Grissom, had gone up and gone down, which is still a big accomplishment, Alan Shepard was the first to go up into space, orbit the Earth, and come back down. So there were a few other things about Project Mercury. So you saw the Mercury 7 before, but actually only 6 of them flew. So there were only 6 flights within Project Mercury. At one point, let's see, this next photo shows it pretty well. Gus Grissom. So Gus Grissom was the second American in space. So when he landed, everything was going pretty well. He landed, and so the ship went out to get him, and this helicopter was out to retrieve the capsule. Now it's kind of hard to see, but if you see, well, I mean, you can see the capsule here, but you see this the kind of speck over here that I'm circling. That is Gus Grissom, and he is on the verge of drowning as this helicopter is focusing on the capsule and not even noticing that his suit is filling with water. There was another accident during Project Mercury where Scott Carpenter, one of the astronauts, there was a miscalculation or misstep somewhere at least, and he landed about 250 miles off of his target in the ocean. So overall, we had a few mishaps, but NASA learned, okay, we can function in space. So if our goal is the moon, we have to do 2 things first. One is we have to get to know the surface of the moon a bit more. For all, no one had been to the moon. Nothing man-made had been to the moon. So it wasn't certain, is the surface very powdery? Will it be able to support the weight of a rocket or a human, or will it just sink through? No one knew. So they had to figure that one out. And 2, the second step, NASA had to figure out, of course, how to actually get there. So we're going to focus on the first one, where NASA has to learn about the surface of the moon. So let's see. Here we go. So what you're looking at now is one of the Ranger probes that NASA had designed. So the purpose of Ranger was it was going to be launched off of Earth, fly to the moon, and then it was going to be hard landing. So it was going to get closer and closer to the moon. And as it got closer, it was going to take photos and send them back to Earth for NASA scientists to look at. And it was going to take photos and send them back to Earth until the very last second where it crashed into the surface. And that was about it. But at least we could get photos from that. Now, unfortunately, Rangers 1 through 6 all failed. Whether they didn't make it into orbit or they missed the moon or something malfunctioned, we weren't able to get photos. However, when they launched Ranger 7, it was successful. This is an example of what they got. So these are some photos that the Ranger 7 probe sent back to NASA scientists. So on the far left, we're about 1,200 kilometers above the surface, so they could get a good high view of these craters and what the surface looks like. In the middle, we're about 15 kilometers up, and on the far right, we're about 6.5 kilometers up, which is about 3 seconds before impact. So this gave NASA some ideas on what the surface of the moon is going to be like, but they wanted to look at, get a bit more information and not just photos from above the surface before it crash landed. So this is where NASA designed the Surveyor craft. I'm going to show the picture of the Surveyor craft in a moment. But I to get this photo, I jump ahead a few years. Spoiler alert, I think you all know we do successfully land on the moon. So the next photo, we jump ahead a bit. But this is the Surveyor craft. This is the Surveyor craft that the astronaut is touching. So the Surveyor crafts were meant to do, they were meant to land softly on the moon. So they were gonna land and not crash land, but they could land as you see it here. It could take some soil samples and get some data and send that back to NASA, or the data, not the soil itself. Then it could take pictures from the surface. So after there were a few Surveyor missions, some of which were failures as well, but some of which were successful. NASA scientists, they needed, and they found, okay, well, the surface of the moon seems like it's smoother in some places, it's rockier in others, but it looks like it can support the weight of a rocket and of a human astronaut. And then also they just, through their photos, geologists determined the craters were not from volcanoes or volcanic activity, rather those were from asteroids. So good information to know before you send someone to the moon. And a little bit about this picture. This is during Apollo 12 in the background. This is where the astronauts landed, and the astronauts came to retrieve a piece of equipment from Surveyor. But I don't want to jump too far ahead. So moving on, okay, so we know the surface of the moon can support our weight, but the next question that NASA had to answer is how do we get there? And this is where Project Gemini came into play. So, so we had the Mercury 7. These were the 7 original astronauts. And then, but this photo is what's known as the next 9. So the next 9 was the next class of astronauts. And so they're all standing here. A few notable, 2 people in particular, you might recognize them already. Here, we have Neil Armstrong, who ends up being the first man to land and walk on the moon. And then this happens to be Pete Conrad. He happens to be the 3rd man to walk on the moon. But so the purpose of Project Gemini, though, is to learn how to actually maneuver in space. We had to learn many different tasks because we learned in Project Mercury we can survive and we can think and act in space, but we're going to have to maneuver and do some work while we're up there. So that's the purpose of Project Gemini. So one of the things that NASA scientists knew we were going to have to do if we were going to go to the moon is we were going to have to be outside of a spacecraft. You know, by definition, if you're walking on the moon, you're walking in a suit. You're not just sitting there in a space capsule. So as Project Gemini, oh, wait, you know what? I skipped a slide. Here we go. I'll go back. So we were going to have to be outside of a spacecraft. So Project Gemini was the first one of the missions where we had our first spacewalk. So here we see this. So now I'll go back. So this, I think this is Ed White, the astronaut. But what the astronaut just exited was the Gemini capsule. So I'll go back here. So on the bottom, we already saw a picture of that. That's the Mercury capsule. And so above here, we have the Gemini capsule, which is quite a bit larger. And then we also see the namesake. So Project Gemini, you can think of the twins, Project Gemini. And so we have 2 astronauts going up. So back to where we were at. So, okay, we knew we were going to have to be outside of a spacecraft. So we better do some spacewalks to figure out how to do that. We also knew that we were going to have to rendezvous. So what does it mean to rendezvous in space? So I think many of you probably know this. If you go back about a decade, think of the space shuttle. When it took off, it would get in space, orbit the Earth maybe a few times, and then meet up with the International Space Station. So then they could dock with the station and astronauts could travel back and forth. So when the space shuttle met up with the International Space Station, that's called a rendezvous. However, back during the 1960s, rendezvous were all pretty theoretical. No one had done it, and there was some skepticism on, is this manageable? Can our astronauts do this? Orbital mechanics are very complicated, and so yeah, so it was not known. But that's what NASA scientists designed Project Gemini for. Is, well, okay, let's test it if we can. And so in this photo, our perspective, you can kind of see the nose cone right here. We're taking the photo from inside one Gemini capsule, and we're taking the photo of this other Gemini capsule, and they get into about within a foot of each other. So NASA figures out pretty quickly, while difficult with a lot of training, though, these NASA astronauts are pretty good and they can make it happen. So they practiced a lot of rendezvousing in Project Gemini. NASA scientists also knew, well, they wanted astronauts to be ready to be in space for about 2 weeks. If they're going to leave the Earth, fly to the moon, walk on the moon for a little bit, and fly back. They wanted to be ready for 2 weeks. So can humans survive in space for 2 weeks? And that was another good test for Project Gemini. And we have a picture. So of course these astronauts are on Earth, but this is Jim Lovell on the left and Frank Borman on the right. This was taken after the 7th flight, so Gemini 7. They had just spent 2 weeks in space. As you saw earlier in that capsule, it's pretty cramped. There's not too much room. There's not really great ventilation either. And there's really you can't get up and walk or anything other than, I guess, a spacewalk. But nonetheless, here they are. They are smelly, they are sweaty, and ready for a shower and shave. But it was a good test for Project Gemini, and it declared, okay, yes, humans can live in space for 2 weeks and survive and come back down. Overall, there were 10 Gemini flights, and each one, like I said, they were very strategic. They made sure to test all these different skills that NASA knew the astronauts were going to have to perform if they were going to go to the moon and back. So next, okay, so we had Project Mercury. Can we survive in space? Project Gemini, can we do all these complex maneuvers in space? And now we have Project Apollo. So Project Apollo is getting to the moon. So to get there, we're going to need a pretty good rocket. So here we have 5 rockets. These 2 on the left, these are actually the Redstone and the Redstone on the left and the Atlas rocket. These were both used during Project Mercury. This is the Titan rocket. So quite a bit bigger, but that was used for Project Gemini. And then you about double that, and we have this. This is the Saturn 1B. This was used for different tests throughout Apollo. However, the rocket that was going to carry humans to the moon is this on the right. This is the Saturn V rocket, which is enormous. To help give perspective, next time you're out walking around campus, I would encourage you near Marston Water Tower to get somewhere where you can see the top of Marston Water Tower. And just think about it. It's pretty tall. But excuse the bad graphics here, but there we go. Marston Water Tower, and that's about to scale. Marston Water Tower is 168 feet tall. The Saturn V was 363 feet tall, so over twice as tall. So just think about that next time you're standing near Marston Water Tower. It's enormous. And then, of course, to power the Saturn V, this was a feat of engineering. It's hard to believe. It went through a lot of fuel. To put that in perspective, some of you may recognize the name Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. So Charles Lindbergh was the first person to fly nonstop across the Atlantic in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, in 1927. So in 1927, when he flew, he had a decent amount of fuel to do that because it was nonstop. However, the Saturn V rocket, so our monster right here, burned more fuel in half a second of running than Charles Lindbergh's plane burned for its entire flight across the Atlantic. So it really is a feat of engineering. There's never been a more powerful rocket ever built, and keep in mind this was designed and built in the 1960s. So it's pretty incredible stuff. And okay, so we have the Cyclone Aide rocket here. Okay, this next photo. So I won't go through all the details of Project Apollo, but there were a few flights leading up to Apollo 11, which is the flight that took us to the moon. This photo is called Earthrise, and it was taken right around Christmas time in 1968. So I mentioned that earlier this presentation, a pretty fraught year on Earth. So Apollo 8, it was the first. So this was the first time any humans had escaped Earth's gravity, and they started to orbit another celestial body, the moon. So here we have this photo in the foreground. This is, of course, the moon. And then we have the Earth, everything mankind has ever known in that frame right there. This was inherently a very dangerous mission, escaping Earth's gravity. If something went wrong, it wasn't certain that there probably wasn't going to be a rescue mission as an option. And so during this photo was taken after the spacecraft of Apollo 8 started to orbit the moon. They took this photo, and they did make it back to Earth. So this was a really important test flight. There are some NASA engineers who claim that, or they think Apollo 8 is the most important mission of the Apollo program, just because of its significance, the first time ever escaping Earth's gravity. So anyways, there's a pretty famous photo and there's a story behind it for you. But now we're going to jump to July 16th, 1969. And this is it. This is the Saturn V rocket with 3 astronauts on it departing Earth. So here we have the cone. This is the command module that we have 3 astronauts. We have Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. And they are okay. So they're being launched off the Earth. This up here, in case you were wondering, that this is called the Launch Escape System, and this itself is actually a small rocket. And if at any point during the launch there's a problem in the Saturn V, if there was any thoughts that it was going to explode or something was going to happen, this would actually pull the command module off of the rocket and fly it to safety where it could parachute down to Earth if needed. Luckily, it was never needed. And okay, so Apollo 11 successfully launched on its way to the moon. It took about 2.5 days to get there. And then, okay, so usually here I play a quick little video that kind of explains it. Here you can see these 2 rockets. This is from Project Gemini and Project Mercury. Here we have the Saturn V. When it launched, let's see if I can. Oh, I can't move that. Okay, bear with me here. When it launched, we have our command module up here. So this is the cone that the astronauts are in, and underneath we have the lunar module. So this is what's going to land on the Earth. And after the Saturn V launched, when it was going to the moon, the astronauts kind of had to reconfigure it. So here you can see, the cone is facing away from the lunar module. Well, in space they had to flip it around, and here we have the command module where all 3 astronauts are, and we have the lunar module over here. So this is what's going to land on the moon. So the plan is, after the astronauts start orbiting the moon, 2 of the astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, are going to crawl through into the lunar module, shut the hatch. So Michael Collins is going to stay orbiting the moon while these 2 go down to the surface. And so then they'll land, they can walk around, and once they do that, okay, so here's a picture of the lunar module on the surface. The plan, so they can, let's see, I want to hide this. I don't know. Okay, well, we'll keep going. There we go. So once they're done exploring the surface of the moon, they can climb a ladder back up to this top part here. And the design is pretty slick. This top part of the lunar module has its own rocket. So the bottom part, is going to serve as the launch pad for the top part to take off. And at that point, they're going to meet up with or rendezvous with Michael Collins, who's also orbiting the moon. And from there, they can fly back to Earth. Okay, so everything is going well. At this point, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin have they're in the lunar module. They're coming down to the surface of the moon. Things are going okay. However, they are they're not exactly where they're supposed to be. Their location is a little off. Okay, they can handle it. But all of a sudden, um, they're not too far from the surface of the moon here. A computer alarm starts to go off. And this computer alarm, there's not supposed to be any computer alarm at this point of the mission. Neil and Buzz are focusing very hard trying to land this lunar module on the moon. And so back at Mission Control in Houston, all the NASA engineers are scrambling, trying to figure out what is this. And this is where a young engineer by the name of Steve Bales. All the engineers in Mission Control look at Steve Bales. So Steve Bales, his part of NASA, actually, okay. I found this while I was doing a little bit of research for him. He's an Iowa State grad. I knew that, but apparently the Department of Aerospace Engineering wanted to give him a page on the website. So they have his picture and they have no description. And you know it's recent because here we have COVID-19. I digress, but that's a picture of Steve Bales. So Steve Bales is one of the NASA engineers who helped with the training of other engineers and the astronauts. And so during these trainings, they had to go through simulations. So when they were going to land on the moon, they were going. It's kind of a one-shot deal. So they went through thousands of hours of simulations. At one point, Steve Bales was going through a simulation, and this alarm started to go off, and he found out it was the 1202 alarm. Now that doesn't mean much to you and I, but to Steve Bales, he knew what that was. First, he knew it was very unlikely that it would go off during a mission, but second, he also knew there was no need to abort the mission because of this. All it meant was a computer was overloaded due to it had a lot of information coming at it, but there was nothing detrimental or dangerous about it. Now, it was a good thing Steve Bales was familiar with the 1202 alarm, because here we are, we're back in the lunar module about to land on the surface of the moon. And you see this black button in here. You can't read it from here, but that says abort. And so all Neil has to do is press the abort button, and then it'll abort the mission. They can hopefully safely go rendezvous with Michael Collins and make it back to Earth. However, there's a lot on the line. America spent billions of dollars and millions of hours and so much training, you name it, to get Neil and Buzz where they are right now. Now, if they were in danger and if something was going to go wrong, absolutely press the abort button. But boy, would it be embarrassing to come so close and have to abort the mission, all because of a false alarm. So back at Mission Control, everyone was looking at Steve Bales. He said, "Don't worry about it. We're going to keep going. No need to abort." Okay, so they kept going. And sure enough, after a very stressful flight, Neil and Buzz make it to the surface of the moon. And here we go. So this is Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, and the photo's taken by Neil Armstrong. You can see him in the reflection of the visor right here. So it was a successful mission. I won't go into too many details, but they were on the surface of the moon for quite some time. They collected some rocks. They took off the moon and made their way back to Earth. So after they splash landed in the ocean, they were picked up. They were given a brief hero's welcome before they were quarantined for 3 weeks. So here they are in a trailer shortly after making it back to Earth. And the reason they were quarantined is NASA scientists weren't sure of any biological dangers that these 3 astronauts had potentially picked up while they were in space. And they didn't want them infecting, all of humanity back on Earth, which makes sense. So anyway, here they are in quarantine. After 3 weeks, they did a world tour. This whole mission had captivated the whole world. To go from barely being able to get a satellite into space to just over a decade later landing 2 of these astronauts on the moon was very phenomenal. Practically impossible, but it happened. So that's the end of Apollo 11. A few more notable photos here. Apollo 13, I think everyone's pretty familiar with the infamous Apollo 13. This is a picture of the command modules, the cone up here. And And so there's an explosion, and the astronauts never made it to the surface of the moon. They were able to orbit the moon, and NASA engineers pulled off a miracle, and of the teamwork and the stress they went through to bring these astronauts back home alive was unbelievable, but they did. Later on in later missions, when they successfully did make it back to the moon, this is the lunar buggy, was actually designed by Boeing. And so this made it, they had a few of these on the moon, and it just enabled NASA astronauts to go further from where they landed and explore more of the moon, because of course they had a very short time on the surface. So that's, like I said, it's a brief history of the space race. There's so much information, we could talk for hours about this, but I hope that kind of gives you an overall good picture of what happened. So like I said, I was going to mention 3 kind of key takeaways here. So 3 lessons in leadership and teamwork here. 1, and I already mentioned this earlier with President John F. Kennedy, he set the tone for the team. He was a very inspiring individual, very busy and important individual, and he had this goal that many thought impossible. Many at NASA thought it was impossible when he claimed this. So there's some panic in NASA there, trying to get ready for this. And but one thing that made him such this is such a great example is, John F. Kennedy didn't have the technical knowledge to really help with the mission to the moon. He didn't have the time, he couldn't micromanage, which was, shouldn't micromanage anyways, but he was the president. He had a lot going on. And so by setting that tone and getting the right people in charge at NASA, those people subsequently put together the right teams full of astronauts, engineers, mathematicians, you name it. And we made it. We made it to the moon and back safely in under the decade. So I mean, what a great leader right there. Number 2 here is constant steps forward lead to overall success. So this was an impossible mission. How are we going to do this? Well, NASA did a really good job at breaking the mission into different parts. So first, with Project Mercury, can humans survive in space? Yes. Next, can humans perform, the tasks they need to do to get us to the moon? Yes. And with every single flight in Project Gemini, they were able to learn more and become more competent in space. And so by breaking it down and being very strategic, they were able to achieve the impossible. And was there hardship? Yes. Were there some deaths? Yes, there were. But everyone knew what was on the line, and everyone was working as a team, and these constant steps forward got them there. And 3, nothing beats a well-practiced and prepared team. So an example, I'm going to point out Steve Bales, the Iowa State engineer who made the call while Neil and Buzz were landing on the moon. They were practiced. They were prepared. At any point, had that alarm gone off, if Steve Bales or no other engineer knew what that was, nobody had time to pull out the lunar module manual here and read, what is this buzzing sound? They had gone through thousands of hours of simulations. And so by doing that, they were ready. They were ready for absolutely everything. And so that, of course, was a key part to the success of the whole mission. An example of Steve Bales, real quick, is, with the manual, having access to knowledge. So even if he could have Googled it, isn't the same thing as being knowledgeable. And so he did a great job with that and allowed them to keep the mission going. So with that, with just a few minutes to spare, that's what I have for you tonight. I hope you found this interesting. Like I said, the Political Science 363 is going to be in, or excuse me, 335 is going to be in springtime at an Iowa State class if you want. But with that, I'll take any questions. If anyone has any questions about the space race or any examples of leadership and teamwork within it.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or since you guys are able to unmute yourselves, feel free to ask them in person too.
I guess my question is, so it seems like it was really fast, going from sending nobody into space at all to going to the moon. I mean, it's absolutely crazy, the technological advancements that happened in that time. I was wondering, why do you think we were able to do that so quickly and be successful at it?
For sure, Sarah. No, that's a great question. There are a lot of reasons, but I think one of the key things here is this became a national priority. So, if you think about, what are some problems we're experiencing right now? We have COVID-19, even, curing cancer or climate change. If we've made that a priority as a country and really put our money and our efforts into that, we could do great things, but we could do these seemingly impossible tasks, and that's because everyone was behind it. So, and because of that, we were able to give NASA the budget to do it. And so, monetary is definitely part of it, but it was the mission of everybody to accomplish this. So priorities. Good question. If you're if you don't feel comfortable asking a question, that's fine. I have my email up on the screen, so feel free to ever shoot me an email too. And I have a list of good NASA themed books. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to share.
All right, so if you guys have no more questions, after this presentation, we have the networking event. So we have the 3 company sponsors, Vermeer, Cargill, and REG, who will be in a booth to speak to you if you'd like, and then also the 5 clubs, ELE, ESC, NSPE, SWE, and Triangle. So all of these links to talk to these people are accessible through the networking page from the schedule page on Canvas. And so you just click on the picture to learn more about that company or the club. And then there should be little boxes that say chat with SWE or chat with Cargill. And if you click on those, it will bring you to the WebEx link. And then I'd also like to thank Rob for speaking. It was really interesting to hear about the space exploration, and your interest in it as well is pretty neat. So thank you.
Thank you, Linnea. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.